And those are all very important in Pitaha. So you've got to be able to hear those tonal distinctions. But obviously tone's not necessary because we don't have it in English, and although English may not be as attractive sounding as Pitaha, it still seems to work. So there are all sorts of things we can add once we get symbols. There are all ways that we can embellish them with sound structures and the kinds of syllables we use, the way we organize things. And then we start to think about how language is represented in the brain. And in the work of Evelina Fedorenko at MIT's Brain and Cognitive Sciences Department, she's found that language is not at all found in just one part of the brain, as people thought for many years, but that it's distributed throughout the brain in what she calls a language network, and that this network is fairly similar across all languages and across all people. But it's a lot more complicated than simply saying it's in Brocau's area. You've heard of that area, or Wernicke's area. Actually, the interesting thing about Brocau's patient is the part of his brain that was damaged was not Brocau's area. But simplistic views of where language is found in the brain are being challenged every day by more research. So there are various ways that we enhance grammar. Morphemes are little parts of words, like the 65,000 Pitaha word forms. There are phrases, sentences, paragraphs, discourses, conversations. All of these are important, and they're found, and they occur naturally over time. The interesting thing about language is, although it's very complicated, once we start to look at a finished system, we can see that its components are relatively simple and build up over time, and that the core component to every aspect of the language that's been built up is the symbol. So what else did Erectus do? Well, by just under 2 million years ago, they were spread out across the world. We find them in Beijing, we find them in Iran, we find them in various parts of the world. We find Erectus. There were still many in Africa, and so they were traveling. And we find a 790,000-year-old settlement in Israel, Yaakov. And in there we find the controlled use of fire, specialized spaces, various components that show, for example, separate areas of the settlement are used for processing meat, processing fish, processing plants, what seem to be communal areas. So Erectus did seem to have the ability to have an organized society. There's evidence that their society was organized. And this is found in this ongoing work in Israel and other places. This is found where the black dot is an Erectus settlement in Israel. There are a lot of interesting archaic human sites in the Middle East, in Israel and other places, because if you're coming out of Africa, at the time they were coming out, because the Sahara Desert was actually a lush green forest, you come out, turn right, and it's all you can do. You can't go straight because that's the ocean. Turn right, and you're in the Middle East, and that's why we find those to be some of the earliest settlements. So here's the excavation in Israel, finding different aspects of it. There's also good evidence that Erectus traveled across distances they could not see across in the ocean. And there are several interesting things to draw from this. First of all, most marine archaeologists argue that you can't have a viable human community without 20 to 40 people arriving roughly at the same time in an area. So when we find evidence of viable human culture in places like Flores in Indonesia, so if you look at the island of Flores in Indonesia, the point where Erectus would have had to cross is about 28 miles. So it's about the size of the English Channel. You could think, well, people swim the English Channel, and we know that other animals could swim across. But Flores is split off from the rest of what would have been at that time the mainland by the strongest ocean current in the world. It's called the Pacific through flow, and it was the same current back then, 750,000 years ago, as far as we can tell. So it was too difficult for a human to swim across that current. In fact, if you just put a raft in the water or just put a log in the water and start off, you're going to get washed out to sea. You're not going to make it. The current is too strong. So For humans to have gotten there, it's highly likely that they had boat building capability. In fact, an archaeologist in Australia, Robert Bednarik, has built boats using erectus tools, Acheulean tools, and level law tools, and shown that he can build boats that can get there in that period of time. The question is, could they have done that without language? There's an article by a Max Planck evolutionary anthropologist, David Gill, called "How Much Grammar Do You Need to Build a Boat?" And he argues that you actually don't need much grammar, but you do need language to be able to build a boat. And so the idea that they could sail, and this is a controversial idea, the things said about the past are controversial. You can say they got there and they had to get there in a certain number, but you can show that they got several places. The ideal thing would be to show them in places where so some people have argued they got across by tsunamis, right? But that sort of defies the physics of tsunamis, which tend to come towards the land. Now, there are cases of people who've been found out to sea. There was a Japanese guy found floating on a roof, I think, after the tsunami that hit Japan a couple of years ago. So it does occasionally happen, but it doesn't seem to be a very productive way of travel, sort of fortuitous. And they did this a lot, even in places where we don't know of tsunamis having hit. So Kotra, the Russian archaeological team, found evidence in Socotra 1.4 million years ago, which is 150 miles from the closest land. We start to see evidence of potential burial. This stone on the right is called Excalibur. It's the colored hand axe of the period, a Acheulean hand axe, and it was found in a grave. Does that mean it was buried on purpose with them? We start to see evidence of that. It's difficult to say convincingly that it was, but it is interesting that it was a colored hand axe found. Around the time that Neanderthal was starting to appear, the Erectus-Neanderthal transition period, we find wooden spears that were preserved for almost 400,000 years, according to some dating, which would have put them back in the time of Erectus. So Erectus, about 1.5 million years ago, they start making extremely complicated tools. They start traveling around the world. They start an evolutionary process, physical, where they start to get more articulate speech, the capacity for more articulate speech. They seem to be mastering boat travel. The ocean was never a barrier to Erectus. Anytime there's an ocean barrier, you can expect to find Erectus on the other side. They had organized settlements. So all of these tasks imply the likelihood of language. If we look at other species and we see species that are far removed from humans that seem to approximate some sort of linguistic ability, it's hardly surprising that we would see an even greater ability in these creatures that were so much like us and had almost modern-sized brains. So if it's correct, there is evidence for language. Nobody could say this case has been proven, but it is highly likely. Once we take off the burden of languages looking like modern languages, and we realize that a language is the transfer of information by the discovery and use of symbols and elaboration of those symbols over time, then we see a gradual evolution of language, and we see evidence of Erectus, and no reason to withhold the judgment that they had language, to account for all the different things that they were able to accomplish in their long history. They were preceded by these guys. These are just a variety, the various species of Australopithecines. Nature experimented a lot before it got to us, you know. That could mean that we're the best, or it could mean that, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that, that we're the best. And when we ask where Erectus went, just look around. We are Erectus. Erectus was the ancestor of Neanderthal, of sapiens, of every other human creature that has existed. They were the smartest creatures the world had ever seen. They were the most widely traveled. They sailed, they built fire, they had settlements, they had strong evidence for symbolism in their tools. It's very difficult to see why we would withhold the judgment that they likely had language. And what they had to have had was more than simply grunts and squeals. They had to have something that was able to communicate actual content about the world around them, the kind of thing that would have been essential and been discovered in symbols. So thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand, I can run this.
Hello, thank you for a nice talk. To my knowledge, what is peculiar to Homo sapiens is the use of actual, what we would today call artwork, such as was seen, of course, in the stone caves in France and perhaps in Africa earlier. Your talk is the first I've heard where you can say that Homo erectus was actually doing, I don't know if you call it art or not. Of course, today we still don't know if what is art and what is not, but that's another matter. But that is one thing that seems to have been peculiar. But even that occurred relatively late in the lifetime of Homo sapiens. Also, I'd be interested to know if you think Homo erectus not only had learned how to use fire, but had actually learned how to make it. So thank you.
Yeah. On fire, the archaeological evidence seems to be that, yes, they could make it. They had controlled use of fire. We find it regularly in their settlements. As far as artwork, this is a red herring that a lot of archaeologists have thought to be somewhat important, because we think of art as symbolic. Actually, some art is symbolic, but a lot of art, especially representational art, is simply iconic. It's a lower level of cognitive development than symbolism. So art is a wonderful accomplishment, but it's not crucial to the linguistic line. It's a sort of red herring to think that if we find painting, it's almost certain that if we find painting, they could talk. But there's no argument from that to that if we don't find painting, they couldn't talk. Painting is just a development. Cultures develop over time. And I know of many cultures that I've done research on in the Amazon that have no art, but they certainly can talk. They don't do anything that is more elaborate in some ways than Homo erectus did. Homo erectus was a hunter-gatherer band. And so we find many cultures today that live fairly similarly. And they're a lot smarter. They have bigger brains. They can think of other things. But and if you take them out of the hunter-gatherer band and raise them in a city, they'll be unrecognizable for anybody else who was raised in the city, which I doubt would be the case for Homo erectus. But at the same time, art doesn't. We want to say that art represents language because it's a complicated cultural accomplishment, and it can be symbolic, but it's often simply iconic. So art seems to be a separate cultural development that is off the line of language evolution. I don't find it convincing to say that art is either here nor there when it comes to language evolution.
Testing. Okay. How would you describe the limitations of their language?
Of erectus?
Yes.
So I work with languages that have similar properties. So in other words, if you think about what the simplest grammar could be, just words in a linear order, I've worked with languages like that. And the fact is, they can say anything we can say. The complicated grammars that we have very useful communicative functions, but they are not necessary to express modern thought or complicated thought. So the fact that we can say they have a simple grammar doesn't mean they have simple thought. That's another thing that has happened in the history of anthropology and linguistics, to somehow think that language is the mirror of thought, and it doesn't have to be. There are a lot of things. For example, I work with hunter-gatherer groups that have very few words for time. Does this mean they don't know there was yesterday? So the Pitaha, for example, have no word for yesterday and no word for tomorrow. And we often find that this or that culture doesn't have a word for X, and so we drive We derive all kinds of conclusions from it, but I don't see any conclusions to draw from that. They can think about those things. Everybody knows they got up yesterday and they're getting up today and they'll probably get up tomorrow. But the fact that they choose not to talk about them is a separate kind of cultural value. I don't find the simplicity of grammar connected very tightly to the complexity of thought. Yeah, they could have said, yeah, if they had symbols, they probably didn't have many limitations. I mean, you could say maybe they had the intelligence of an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old sapiens child. No way to really know that, but let's say they did. 8-year-olds can talk a lot.
I'm curious if we know how easy or difficult it is to know whether a tool that they used was made by them and not created by nature. How can we discern?
Well, it's always very hard when you're going back in time to have dating methods that can link them to a species. So if you find a tool that's 600,000 years old, they were the only ones around. So nobody else was around, so they made it. But if you find a tool that was 150,000 years old, well, there were a lot of species of humans around at that time. So narrowing it down to Homo erectus becomes more difficult, but you can guess based on the settlement patterns, but it's difficult to tell with precision once you start getting into the area where other Homo species were existing side by side. Oh, that it was made. Some of the Oldowan tools could have just, one rock fell on another and suddenly you get this. But these Acheulean tools, these more complex tools, there's no way they came about by accident. They had to have been designed, planned, and constructed with a great deal of craftsmanship. It takes hundreds of hours, at least 500 hours from what I've heard, for a graduate student in archaeology to be able to make an Acheulean hand axe. Not to make, that's how long it takes to learn it. They can make them faster after that.
I'm curious to know, what led to the, eventual demise of this species, given your talk, how successful they have been at traveling and establishing communities all around the world. So I'm just curious, what led to, a global end to such a successful run?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We're the only ones left standing. So did they die out? Did they become us? One answer is they didn't die. We are them. The other answer is that Homo sapiens is, they're smarter, and one thing we've shown as a species throughout our history is the ability to slaughter other people that look like us. So the fact that Homo sapiens might have killed them all doesn't seem to be totally outside the realm of possibility either. So I don't know why they disappeared. And I was asked a similar question when I was giving a talk in Hungary, and I probably should have been more careful, but I said, the Hungarian Jews didn't disappear because they didn't have language. So there are all kinds of reasons that people disappear.
Hi. You briefly said at the beginning that the Homo erectus, there was one that they found a hyoid bone in it. So
Yeah.
that you're speculating that, then they have vocal cords and they could then, produce sounds. So are you thinking the later species all had the hyoid bones and could vocalize?
We don't really know. Some people, Tecumseh Fitch would believe that we almost certainly had Homo erectus had this modern speech capability. My point is that it really doesn't matter. Evolving modern speech is a tremendous advantage, but it's not a necessary condition, nor is it a sufficient condition for having language. We can look at other species that seem to have, listen to a parrot. They can produce human speech sounds fairly